They always thought my silence meant I had nothing to say, as if quietness were the same as emptiness, as if staying calm meant I lacked the courage to defend myself. What they never understood was that my silence was not weakness, it was observation, patience, restraint. I watched everything. I remembered everything. Every sarcastic comment disguised as a joke, every decision made without my voice, every moment when my feelings were brushed aside as if they were too small to matter. I learned early on that speaking up in a room where no one listens is just another form of humiliation, so I chose silence, not because I feared them, but because I was measuring them. I was learning the patterns of their behavior, the small cracks in their confidence, the way their masks slipped when they thought no one noticed. I saw their manipulations, the alliances they formed behind closed doors, the subtle digs delivered with a smile, and I tucked every detail into the quiet corners of my mind, waiting for the moment when all those pieces would matter. But silence has a way of making people bold in the worst way. They started assuming I would accept anything, tolerate anything, endure anything. They thought my quiet nature meant I didn't have limits, that I didn't have pride, that I didn't know how wrong they were. I could feel the shift every time they dismissed my opinion, every time they made decisions about my life without even including me, every time they told my story as if it belonged to them. The more silent I remained, the more loudly their arrogance grew. They forgot that a person who stays silent is not necessarily submitting. Sometimes silence is simply the space where strength is sharpening itself. Sometimes silence is where rage starts learning how to speak. I remember sitting in the middle of conversations where my name was mentioned as though I wasn't even there. They talked over me, around me, through me, as if my existence was only a background detail. They mistook my patience for compliance, my endurance for fragility, believing I was too soft, too scared, or too dependent to ever push back. They never questioned why I didn't react, why I didn't argue, why I didn't rise to every insult. They never imagined that the quietest person in the room might also be the one paying the closest attention. They never considered that silence could be strategy. There were moments when their words stung, when their dismissive glances cut deeper than they realized. Moments when I wanted to speak up, to shout back, to remind them that I was not as invisible as they wished me to be. But each time, I held myself still. I let them reveal themselves fully, layer by layer, because truth shows itself most clearly when someone thinks no one is watching. And I was watching. I saw the entitlement in their actions, the comfort they felt in belittling me, the confidence they had in my silence. They thought I would always absorb the blows, always stand in the shadows, always keep the peace no matter the cost to myself. What they didn't see was the quiet tension building inside me, the slow, steady rise of a resolve they never imagined I possessed. People forget that silence can be strength when it comes from choice rather than fear. They forget that the storms that move slowly are often the ones that change everything when they finally arrive. My silence was not surrender. It was protection of my energy, of my dignity, of my future. It was the silence of someone who was learning, preparing, waiting. Waiting for the right moment, the right truth, the right shift. I wasn't staying quiet because I had no voice. I was staying quiet because I was choosing where to invest it. I wasn't swallowing my pain. I was storing it, letting it settle into summit. Every assumption they made about me became another piece of fuel. Every underestimation became a reminder of why I needed to stand firm when the time came. I began to understand that the power they believed they held over me was built entirely on their belief that I wouldn't challenge them. And for a long time, I let them believe that. I let them grow comfortable. I let them think I would always stay in the background, too timid to step forward, too loyal to disrupt the roles they had written for me. They thought they understood me, thought they knew my limits, thought they had me figured out. They never realized that the person they were dismissing was quietly becoming the person they would one day fear disappointing, fear losing, fear underestimating again. The truth was simple. I wasn't silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was stronger than they ever gave me credit for, strong enough to hold back until the moment mattered most. My silence was my strength, and they had no idea how powerful that made me. The moment my family crossed the line didn't arrive with loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. it slipped into the room quietly, settling around me like a weight I didn't ask to carry. It happened in one of those ordinary moments when you expect nothing but familiarity, nothing but the routine flow of life, because that's what family is supposed to be: safe, predictable, a space where you don't have to guard yourself. But it was in that ordinary moment that something shifted, something subtle yet unmistakable. It was the moment I realized the difference between misunderstanding and disrespect, between a mistake and a deliberate choice, between a careless comment and an intentional wound. It was the moment they didn't just forget my worth, they erased it. It started with a decision they made without me, a decision about me, one they didn't even feel the need to inform me about until everything was already done. They talked in hushed tones behind doors they didn't bother closing fully, assuming I wouldn't question it, wouldn't challenge it, wouldn't dare disturb their plans. They acted as though my life were a piece on a board they moved whenever it suited them, as if my needs were negotiable and my boundaries were optional. I remember standing there, hearing my name tossed around like it belonged to everyone but me, hearing assumptions about my future made by people who didn't even ask what I wanted. That was the moment the line was crossed, not because the decision itself was the worst thing they could have done, but because of the entitlement behind it, the belief that I didn't deserve to be included in conversations about my own life. It was more than a single choice, it was the accumulation of every small disrespect that led to that exact moment. Every time they dismissed my dreams because they didn't fit their expectations. Every time they told me what I should do, not what I could do. Every time they made promises on my behalf, commitments I neither agreed to nor wanted. Every time they prioritized someone else's comfort, someone else's desires, someone else's voice over mine. It all built up quietly, patiently, until that moment when everything clicked. I finally saw the pattern clearly, how they had been shaping my role in the family without my consent, molding me into a version of myself that benefited them, not me. What hurt wasn't just their actions but the ease with which they carried them out. There was no hesitation, no questioning, no pause to think about my feelings. It was as though my emotions had never been part of their considerations, as though my silence had given them permission to take control of every part of my identity. And maybe that was their mistake, confusing silence with surrender, confusing patience with approval. They didn't notice the moments when I pulled back emotionally, when I stopped trying to explain myself, when I stopped expecting understanding. They didn't realize that by the time they crossed the line, I had already begun to realize my worth outside of their perspective. I remember looking at their faces, seeing the casual confidence they wore like armor, the certainty that I would simply go along with whatever they decided. There was something almost surreal about it, observing them from a distance even though I was standing right there. It was like watching a scene where everyone else knew their script except me. For the first time, instead of feeling hurt or confused, I felt clarity, a sharp, cold clarity that sliced through every illusion I had tried to hold on to. They weren't acting out of love. They were acting out of habit. Habit made from years of believing I would never push back, never contradict them, never assert my voice. That realization was the true line-crossing moment. It wasn't just the decision they made, it was the revelation that they had stopped seeing me as a person with a voice, with agency, with boundaries. They saw me as a function, a role, an extension of their expectations. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The moment felt like a slow, internal unraveling, a quiet breaking away from the version of myself they had constructed. It was painful, yes, but it was also liberating in a way I didn't expect. Because once someone crosses a line, once they show you what they truly think of you, you stop trying to justify. I found myself replaying old memories, moments I had brushed aside or forgiven too quickly. Times when my opinions were met with laughter, when my boundaries were treated like suggestions, when my achievements were minimized or overshadowed. Times when I adjusted myself to fit their comfort, shrinking parts of who I was to avoid conflict. I had told myself it was normal, that every family had its flaws, that love meant compromise. But standing there, realizing how easily they dismissed me, it became clear that this was never compromise, it was erasure. That moment became a turning point not because I suddenly grew stronger, but because I finally stopped lying to myself. I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt they didn't deserve. I stopped believing that their behavior would change if I just tried harder, spoke softer, waited longer. I saw the truth. They crossed the line because they believed they could, because they believed I'd never call them out, never stand up, never choose myself over their expectations. The moment they crossed the line was the moment I started drawing new ones, quietly, internally, without announcement. Lines that protected me. Lines that separated their wants from my needs, their assumptions from my reality, their control from my choices. I wasn't angry, not at first. I was awake. Truly awake. And once you wake up, you can never return to the version of yourself that tolerated what should never have been tolerated in the first place. Realizing the power of standing up didn't hit me all at once, it arrived slowly, like a light that grows brighter in a room you didn't even realize had grown dim over the years. For so long, I had been conditioned to believe that staying quiet was safer, that avoiding conflict was the only way to keep the peace, that my voice was something to be used sparingly, gently, cautiously. I grew up believing that speaking up made you difficult, ungrateful, dramatic. I learned to weigh every word before letting it leave my mouth, to soften my opinions so they wouldn't rub anyone the wrong way, to carry my disappointments privately so no one would accuse me of causing trouble. But there comes a moment in every person's life when silence becomes too heavy to hold, when the truth you've been burying inside you starts pushing against the walls you built to contain it, when your own need for self-respect becomes louder than the fear of upsetting others. It wasn't one event but a series of realizations that brought me to that point. I began to see how much of my life had been shaped by accommodating others, how often I had dismissed my own needs in order to make someone else comfortable. I saw how easily people grew accustomed to my silence, how they began to expect it, to depend on it, to assume it would always be there serving them. And I realized something that shook me deeply: people don't just take advantage of your silence, they start to believe they're entitled to it. They start to act as though your quietness exists for their benefit, as though your restraint is their privilege, as though your emotions, opinions, and boundaries are things they are free to ignore. The first time I spoke up, even in a small way, something shifted inside me. My voice didn't tremble the way I expected. My words didn't crumble under pressure. In fact, they felt solid, grounded, sharper than I imagined they could be. It wasn't a shout, not a dramatic declaration, just a simple, firm statement of. There is a certain kind of clarity that comes when you realize that your peace cannot be built on the discomfort of silencing yourself. That every time you swallow your pain to protect others, you harm yourself a little more. That the people who truly care about you will never ask you to stay small so they can feel big, will never demand your silence so they can remain comfortable, will never expect you to sacrifice your dignity for the sake of keeping the family dynamics smooth. Standing up isn't about fighting, it's about declaring that your worth is not up for negotiation. The more I allowed myself to speak, to question, to refuse, the more I felt parts of myself returning, parts one thought I had lost, parts one thought were too damaged to be useful anymore. I realized I had spent years trying to be the easy one, the understanding one, the one who didn't make problems. And yet, despite all that effort, it never earned me the respect I hoped for. In fact, it did the opposite. It taught people that they could dismiss me, manipulate situations around me, and expect me to simply accept whatever was handed to me. But when I stood up, even gently, even quietly, I felt a shift in how I looked at myself. I wasn't waiting for validation anymore. I wasn't asking for permission. I wasn't hoping someone else would finally notice my worth. I was claiming it. What surprised me most was how quickly strength grows when you give it space. One boundary led to another. One honest conversation opened the door to many more. One refusal to be disrespected became the foundation for a life where respect was no longer optional. And with each step, the fear that used to hold me back faded a little more. I realized that the people who were most threatened by my voice were the ones who benefited from my silence. Their discomfort was not my fault, it was their reaction to losing control they should never have had in the first place. Standing up for myself didn't suddenly make everything perfect. It didn't remove the challenges or erase the damage of the past. But it changed me. It changed the way I walked into a room, the way I engaged with the world, the way I valued myself. It made me understand that strength isn't loud. It isn't aggressive. It isn't something you perform. True strength is quiet and steady. It's the courage to say no when everyone expects you to say yes. It's the bravery to walk away from roles that suffocate you. It's the decision to honor yourself even when others don't. And once you realize that kind of power, once you feel it rising inside you, once you experience what it's like to finally stand up, you can never go back to the version of yourself that allowed others to define your place, your voice, your worth, your boundaries. The shift from endurance to action didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded gradually, like a tide that keeps rising until you suddenly realize the shore you once stood on has completely changed. For years, I convinced myself that enduring everything quietly was the mature thing to do, the peaceful thing to do, the responsible way to hold a family together. I told myself that patience was strength, that letting things pass was wisdom, that absorbing the blame, the pressure, the expectations was just part of my role. But endurance, when stretched too far, begins to feel less like strength and more like captivity. And I reached a point where the weight of everything I had been tolerating became too heavy to carry any further. It wasn't a breakdown, it was a breaking open. A realization that surviving is not the same as living, and that patience without boundaries becomes permission for others to mistreat you. It started with small decisions, almost invisible ones at first. A moment where I chose not to stay silent. A moment where I said no without apologizing. A moment where I refused to be blamed for something I didn't do. These moments seemed insignificant to others, but to me, they were seismic shifts. They were the first cracks in the shell of endurance I had been wrapped in for far too long. I began to notice how different it felt to honor my own needs instead of burying them. I began to see how freeing it was to say what I truly felt instead of swallowing words that burned in my throat. I began to understand that action doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it simply looks like reclaiming 1 inch of space after losing miles of it. As I stepped into this new phase, something else became clear. The people who had grown comfortable with my silence were not prepared for my voice. Those who had benefited most from my endurance were the first to feel threatened by my actions. They questioned my choices, my tone, my reasons. They said things like "you've changed," or "why are you making things difficult," or "why can't you just let it go like before," as if my silence had been a gift to them, as if my suffering had been some kind of service I owed the family. But their discomfort only confirmed one thing for me: they were never upset about my actions, they were upset about losing control. They weren't angry that I was standing up. They were angry that I had stopped allowing them to lean on me in ways that damaged me. The more I acted, the more clarity I gained. Endurance had kept me surviving, but action made me feel alive. I stopped waiting for people to respect me and started respecting myself first. I stopped hoping they would finally understand me and began understanding myself instead. I stopped shrinking to avoid conflict and learned to stand my ground even when it made others uneasy. Every step I took toward action revealed how much of my life had been sh. I also learned that action doesn't always mean speaking louder. Sometimes action means walking away from arguments that go nowhere. Sometimes it means setting boundaries that others never imagined you'd enforce. Sometimes it means choosing your mental and emotional well-being over someone else's expectations. And as I grew more comfortable taking action, I realized how deeply endurance had been rooted in me. It wasn't just a habit, it was a survival mechanism I had learned long before I was even aware of it. But what once protected me was now suffocating me. Endurance had kept me standing, but it had also kept me stuck. What surprised me most was how action reshaped my sense of identity. For so long, I had defined myself by how much I could take, how much I could tolerate, how much I could endure without breaking. I thought being strong meant staying quiet, staying calm, staying composed no matter how unfair things became. But acting taught me a different kind of strength, the strength to disrupt the pattern instead of surviving it. The strength to choose myself instead of choosing peace that only existed on the surface. The strength to accept that not everyone will applaud your growth, especially if they benefited from your lack of it. My relationships began to shift as well. Some people distanced themselves because they were uncomfortable with the version of me who no longer absorbed everything. Others tried to test my boundaries, as if pushing me would make me retreat into the old version of myself. And a few, though rare, respected the change and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Through these shifts, I began to see who truly valued me, and who valued only what I did for them. Action exposed truths that endurance had kept hidden. It revealed the emotional economy of my family, the unfair transactions, the unequal expectations, the unspoken roles. And as painful as it was, it also gave me the power to rewrite those dynamics. The shift from endurance to action also brought a quiet form of confidence. Not loud, not boastful, but steady. A confidence that came from knowing I didn't have to suppress myself to be loved or accepted. A confidence that came from choosing honesty over convenience. A confidence that reminded me that I had a right to exist fully, not just in the shadows of other people's comfort. And with every boundary I enforced, with every truth I spoke, with every decision I made for myself, I felt that confidence growing roots inside me. Strong roots. Roots that no amount of guilt or manipulation could loosen. In the end, this shift wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming ownership of my life, my voice, my choices. It was about understanding that endurance may keep you intact, but action helps you transform. And once that transformation begins, once you take even the smallest step toward reclaiming yourself, you realize there is no going back to the version of you who stayed silent, who endured everything, who believed strength meant suffering quietly while the world decided your worth for you. Confronting those who underestimated me wasn't a sudden burst of courage, it was the natural progression of everything I had endured, everything I had realized, everything I had quietly collected over the years. For so long, I had allowed their assumptions to shape the way they treated me. They believed I was fragile, incapable of real confrontation, too soft-hearted to ever push back. They assumed my silence was a permanent trait, not a temporary choice. They thought I would always bend, always adjust, always sacrifice my own comfort so theirs could remain intact. But every assumption they made became a spark, and eventually those sparks grew into a fire I could no longer contain. Confrontation didn't come from anger alone, it came from clarity about who I was, and who I refused to be anymore. The first confrontation was not a shouting match or an explosion of emotions. It was calm, almost unnervingly calm. I had spent years rehearsing the words I never said, imagining the moment when I would stand tall in front of the people who believed I never would. When it finally happened, it felt less like a battle and more like a release. I spoke with a steadiness they didn't expect, a firmness they had never heard from me. I didn't shake. I didn't back down. I didn't soften the truth to protect their feelings. For the first time, I allowed my words to come out unfiltered, and the shock on their faces told me everything. They had never imagined I possessed this version of myself. What surprised me was how quickly the dynamic shifted. Those who had always controlled the conversation suddenly struggled to form words. Those who had always dismissed my opinions leaned forward, trying desperately to understand. Those who used to tower over me with their confidence now looked smaller, unsure, unsettled. It wasn't because I had become aggressive, it was because I had become undeniably honest. And honesty, especially from someone they had underestimated for years, is a powerful thing. It disrupts the balance. It exposes the imbalance. It forces people to face truths they worked hard to avoid. Confrontation, I discovered, isn't about proving someone wrong, it's about finally standing in your own truth without apology. It's about refusing to make yourself smaller to protect someone else's illusions. It's about letting them see the strength you no longer feel the need to hide. And as I continued confronting them, not with cruelty, but with clarity, something profound happened. The fear I once carried dissolved. Their disappointment no longer felt like a threat. Their judgment no longer had the power to silence me. Their reactions no longer determined my worth. I realized that the people who underestimate you do so because it benefits them. They create a version of you that is EA. Some confrontations were gentle but firm. Others were sharper, born out of years of suppressed hurt. I confronted the dismissiveness, the manipulation, the emotional imbalance they tried to disguise as family dynamics. I confronted the guilt they used like a leash, pulling me back every time I tried to choose myself. I confronted the comments masked as jokes, the decisions made without me, the expectations they placed on my shoulders without ever considering the weight. And with every confrontation, I reclaimed something, my voice, my space, my dignity. Not everyone responded the same way. Some acted startled, as if they had never realized how their behavior affected me. They apologized awkwardly, stumbling over words they weren't used to saying. Others grew defensive because facing the truth meant acknowledging their own flaws, and that was something they were never prepared to do. A few tried to dismiss my words, tried to twist the conversation back to old patterns, but I didn't let them. Every time they tried to pull me into the past, I stood even taller in the present. And then there were those who looked almost relieved that I was finally expressing what they had sensed but never heard. Confrontation, it turns out, reveals everything: who values you, who fears losing control, and who only loved you when you were silent. The most powerful confrontations were the ones where I didn't raise my voice at all. I simply stated what I would no longer accept, what I would no longer sacrifice, what I would no longer tolerate. There is something undeniably strong about calm confrontation. It forces the other person to listen instead of react, to absorb instead of defend. And in those moments, I realized that strength isn't something you receive from others, it's something you claim within yourself. Through every confrontation, I was rebuilding the identity they had slowly chipped away. I was showing them the version of me they never bothered to see, the one who was observant, resilient, thoughtful, and far stronger than they imagined. And the more I confronted the false narratives they created about me, the more those narratives crumbled. They saw that the quiet one wasn't weak. The patient one wasn't helpless. The forgiving one wasn't naive. I wasn't the person they had painted in their minds. I was someone entirely different, someone they had underestimated for far too long. What I didn't expect was how confrontation would transform me internally. For the first time, I felt aligned with myself. My words matched my feelings. My boundaries matched my worth. My actions matched my identity. I felt whole in a way silence had never allowed me to feel. And as I continued confronting situations that once paralyzed me with fear, I grew lighter. Not because the confrontations were easy, but because the truth was no longer trapped inside me. In the end, confronting those who underestimated me wasn't about revenge, it was about revelation. It revealed who they were, but it also revealed who I had become. Someone who no longer hid behind endurance. Someone who no longer carried guilt for wanting respect. Someone who no longer feared being seen for who they truly were. Someone who realized that confrontation, when rooted in self-respect, is not aggression, it is transformation. Transforming pain into strength and clarity wasn't an instant awakening, it was a slow, often messy process of unlearning, rebuilding, and rediscovering the parts of myself I had hidden away for years. Pain has a strange way of becoming familiar, almost comfortable, when you've carried it long enough. You begin to mistake it for a part of your personality, a part of your destiny, something you're meant to endure quietly because that's what you've always done. But there comes a moment when the weight of that pain becomes impossible to ignore, when it stops being something you can simply tolerate and starts becoming something that forces you to change. My moment came not with an explosion, but with an undeniable truth. I could no longer live in the version of myself that my family's treatment had shaped. The pain they caused was real, but the person it revealed was even more real. At first, the pain felt overwhelming. It echoed in my mind long after conversations ended, it lingered in the quiet moments of my day, it resurfaced when I least expected it. Every memory replayed itself with new meaning, showing me the patterns I had once dismissed as small or insignificant. I realized how deeply the dismissiveness, the assumptions, the pressure, and the underestimation had seeped into my identity. I had internalized their voices so completely that I sometimes mistook them for my own. But when I finally acknowledged that the pain wasn't random, that it had been building over years of silence and sacrifice, something inside me shifted. Pain, when examined, becomes a teacher. It reveals the boundaries you should have set earlier. It exposes the people who never deserved the access they had. It uncovers the truths you were too afraid to face. There were still difficult days. There were moments when memories stung, when old habits tried to pull me back into silence, when guilt attempted to disguise itself as loyalty. But even in those moments, I felt a new foundation underneath me, a foundation built through every confrontation, every boundary, every moment of courage. The pain that once felt like a burden had become evidence of everything I had survived. And survival, when viewed through the right lens, becomes strength. Through this transformation, I started to see my family's behavior differently, not as reflections of my worth, but as reflections of their own limitations. Their inability to see my strength didn't mean it wasn't there. Their failure to respect my boundaries didn't mean I didn't deserve respect. Their expectations didn't define my identity. The clarity I gained allowed me to separate their actions from my value. I realized that the people who caused the pain could no longer be allowed to shape the person I was becoming. My growth was mine. My strength was mine. My future was mine. And as I continued to transform, I discovered something even more powerful: pain can be fuel. It can propel you toward a life where you honor yourself, where you trust your instincts, where you no longer shrink to make others comfortable. It can help you see through manipulation, stand firm against guilt, recognize unhealthy patterns, and break cycles that once felt impossible to escape. Pain, when understood, becomes clarity. Clarity becomes empowerment. Empowerment becomes transformation. Looking back, I see now that everything I went through shaped a version of me I didn't know I had the potential to become. Someone more aware. Someone more grounded. Someone more courageous. Someone who doesn't just survive but evolves. Someone who understands that the most powerful revenge is not anger or retaliation, it's transformation. Becoming stronger than the pain. Becoming wiser than the people who caused it. Becoming a version of yourself they never believed you could be.